at Color of Poverty, one of the things we wanted to do was to highlight some of the work that people are doing internationally, and also to ponder that question of, is there any point? Why do we do it? How does it help? Is it really confusing? And those questions actually come out of when I started doing this work, and the generosity of some of the people you're going to hear from today and many others around answering those questions for me. And so I think, this morning when we heard from people, you can see the interweavedness and connectedness of what happens globally and what happens in the international sphere and what it can do for us here. So without further delay, I'm going to turn this session over to Seema Kawar, who is our moderator for a panel on the launch of our UN guide or toolkit. And she has with her several pretty incredible panelists who have inspired me with the work that they've done at the UN. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Shalini. I was going to say that happens to all of us, I think, at around 3 p.m., but so very relatable. And thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. I would also like to thank our wonderful panelists, Samia, Angela, Anthony, and Debbie, who've done amazing work in this sector. And I believe you can see their bios on the screen, and they're available in the program as well. Just to mention that I work with the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights. I'm a senior legal and policy advisor there, and have done some of this work internationally with Samia, actually. So looking forward to the discussion today. Just to mention that, unfortunately, because the panel is limited to 30 minutes, there won't be time for a Q&A with the audience. But if you have any questions, please put them in the chat or email them to one of the organizers, and we'll make sure that they get to the right person or panelist so that they can follow up with you. So I think we'll get started first by turning to Samia to give us an overview of this UN toolkit that has been developed. Go ahead, Samia.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Seema. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try to be tech savvy while I do this because I want to share two documents at the same time. So let's try to make that happen. So the first document is our beautifully designed toolkit, which we will be sharing with all the attendees of the session today. And the second is the Word document of the French translation. So I wanted to make sure that folks know that there is a French translation that is going through the design process at the moment. And as soon as we have that design ready, we will also be launching the French version of the UN toolkit. I'm not going to take up a lot of time, like Seema said. We only have 30 minutes for this panel, which includes the launch of this toolkit. So the toolkit is basically designed by Color of Poverty, Color of Change, for community-based organizations, or CSOs, as they're often referred to within the UN world, which is civil society organizations. And it's also for grassroots organizations to get involved with the UN process and have your voice heard, and the voices of your communities heard through that at the international level. I know a lot of us do a lot of advocacy at the domestic level, but this is particularly for the international level. So there's various different parts of the toolkit. Again, I don't have a lot of time to go through all of the parts, but generally, the toolkit starts off with giving you reasons in terms of why you should be involved with the UN. I don't need to go into details on that. I know today has just been kind of a testimony as to why we should be involved in this process. Canada is a signatory to a lot of UN conventions, a lot of different UN treaties. And as civil society organizations, it's our responsibility to hold Canada accountable to a lot of the conventions that it has signed. So it's also an opportunity, like Seema said. We went last year and participated in the Universal Periodic Review. So it's an opportunity for us to also meet with colleagues from all across Canada, and also colleagues from all over the world that believe in social justice, human rights, and humanitarian law, and engage with the UN. So what you'll find in the toolkit, so after you are encouraged to get involved through why you should get involved, So there is an explanation of what is a UN treaty, or a human rights treaty, or an instrument, and it goes through that process of explaining how different treaties are formed, and the names of different treaties as well. So, and there's a bunch of hyperlinks in the toolkit that will give you more information. So it is supposed to be a concise toolkit, so we don't have.
I'm sorry, Samia, for stopping, for interrupting you, but if
Yep.
possible to speak a bit slower for the
Yeah,
interpreter.
sure.
Thank you very much.
Sure. I have 2 minutes, but I will try to slow my tone down and get this
Thank you.
26-page document through in the 2 minutes. So there's an explanation of the different treaties that are specifically related to social justice work. The next section is on the ICERD, which is the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And again, this is one of the most important pieces that Canada has signed on to, and for you to get involved, especially in the realm of racial justice change making. And it also tells you about how exactly you can get involved, about the different processes of the CERD review. So you can see there's a step-by-step guide on how to do that. And then the next section is on the Universal Periodic Review process. So this is also a very important process, especially for organizations that are interested in human rights and racial justice and social justice. In this section, it also kind of gives you an overview of what the process looks like, what the different timelines are, and again, how to get involved, because Canada is reviewed every 4 to 5 years within this process. And it's a really great way to, again, hold our country accountable for many of the treaties and conventions it has signed. Next section is just some tools, experts, committees, and working groups and networks. So this includes even special repertoires that you should be aware of, again, related to racial justice work, ad hoc committees that you might want to stay tuned with, and then different forums that are also part of the United Nations work. And the 6th section is on shadow reports. Again, it explains how shadow reports work. So basically, these are reports that you can do that is in addition to the report that the Government of Canada submits to the United Nations based on different committees. And these reports are often used to show community-based data, storytelling, and to cover some of the points that are missed often in official government reports. And then there, section 7 talks about the ECOSOC status, what that is, what are the benefits, and how organizations can apply to have ECOSOC status within the United Nations. So it's an accreditation by the UN Economic and Social Council, which helps you gain a certain status within the United Nations to be able to make submissions, to be able to present. And finally, there is a list of UN days, weeks, years, and decades that are listed near the end of the toolkit. And this is just important for organizations that are planning their events or planning certain activities that could be attached to some of those days. And that's always a strategic way. If you're launching something, releasing something, it's always good to have this in mind. So I know I went over my 2 minutes, Seema, I apologize, but I'll stop sharing my screen.
Oh, no problem, Samia. Thanks so much. That looks like such a valuable tool, a really comprehensive guide. So thanks for sharing that. Maybe what we can do is, given the time, we can direct the first questions to Debbie and Anthony, and then the questions after to Samia and Angela, if that works. So Debbie, maybe we can start with you. If you can tell us just about why you've engaged with this type of work, and any sort of successful real-life examples, outcomes from this work would be really helpful as well, if you can touch on that.
Sure. Thanks a lot. It's so good to have spent the day in this company. This last day of Black History Month, Afrofuturism. I thank Marie Clark Walker for calling in our ancestors at the beginning. So very glad to be joining all of you here. It was my attendance at the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa in 2001 that really opened my eyes to um, how the UN instruments that Canada has signed on to could be used to advance our policy and systems work here at home. The event provided an opportunity to learn about how other movements in other countries um, dealing with similar issues of intersectional racisms, use the UN instruments to hold their governments accountable. It was also an opportunity, as Samia said in her remarks, to engage with other Canadian NGOs to begin to build relationships, but as important, to engage with international NGOs, with organizations and movements in other countries who had a similar goal in the kinds of society that they're wanting to create. It sparked ideas in terms of what we can do once we move back and how it is that we can coordinate our work when we meet in these international spaces. It was interesting. I realized that engagement in the UN brings civil society organizations together, but also in terms of strategies and tactics, right? And even more important for me, learning from each other's mistakes. What didn't work? What actually set the movement back, and how it is that we can course correct. Those of us who attended, including some of us who went on to co-found Color of Poverty, Color of Change, some 6 or 7 years later, I think came back committed and really wanting to see how we could use and take up space. And I must say, I want to stop here and just acknowledge Margaret Parsons, the former executive director of the then African Canadian Legal Clinic, who really set the example and opened up spaces for Black and racialized organizations here in Canada to really engage at the UN, in the UN space. She coordinated us. She ensured that we had space there to meet, to align our recommendations. She convened spaces for us to amplify each other's recommendations, each other's analysis and arguments. Of course, Indigenous communities, especially Indigenous First Nations from the West Coast here in Canada, had a history of engaging with the UN on various treaty issues, and so they were there. And I think some of our first experiences of engaging with the UN forced us to really begin to think through how it is that we can engage and build relationship with First Peoples here in Canada. How do we amplify their voices? But as importantly, how do we educate them about our own issues, especially when there were overlap around issues of racial justice and equity here in Canada?
Thank you so much, Debbie. And Anthony, maybe you can share your experience and any outcomes that you've seen be successful out of these types of engagements.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to share. There's so much that I would like to say, but I want to pick up off what Debbie said. I refer to as Auntie Debbie, or Elder Debbie. So what got me involved? I honestly inherited this tradition of resistance at the international level that was started by many of the folks. Not started, but continued. But they brought me in. Elder Debbie. There was Michael Kerr, Shalini, now Justice Go. With the Color of Poverty, bringing forth these works at the international level. But it was an opportunity I had through the African Canadian Legal Clinic. So I was fortunate in 2014, while working at the clinic, to be asked to go to New York at the headquarters of the United Nations to represent the clinic at the launch of the International Decade for People of African Descent. So that was in 2014. And so through that process, it made me understand more about what was available in terms of levers for advancing change at the international level. And then through, again, Margaret's support at the African Canadian Legal Clinic, months later, I got to go back to New York for the the launch of the International Day for the Commemoration of the Victims of the Transatlantic Slave Trade and Slavery, again in New York, where there is an unveiling of a permanent monument. And so, for context, this is my first year of practice as a lawyer, and so it was really formative. It really opened my mind to the opportunities that exist. Although those were commemorative celebrations and recognitions, what it then pushed me to do is want to contribute to that space. And so then I got yet another opportunity as I continued to work with the clinic to draft a shadow report. Shadow reports as documented or explained within the toolkit that is forthcoming. And so I had an opportunity to prepare a shadow report with a then student, with another student at the time. And I was a lawyer working with the student, and that was for the Committee on Human Rights. So this is the International Convention for Civil and Political Rights. And then months later, do another shadow report, but this time for the committee or the International Covenant. I apologize. International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And so to produce that shadow report, but then for the second shadow report, go to Geneva. And again, this was Debbie Shalini, previously Avi Go, or now Justice Co, and Michael Kerr, to do some of that advocacy at the international level. I know I don't have a lot of time, but some really critical outcomes that have come out of it, because my point of entry was people of African descent, so Black communities across Canada, and learning, of course, from the ways in which Indigenous communities have effectively struggled and leveraged change in that space. There have been several spaces where there's been recognition of systemic racism experienced by people of African descent that had been under-recognized before that within Canada. And so specifically, I'm thinking about the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism back in 2003, Doudou Diène, made a visit to Canada, and the African Canadian Legal Clinic and other advocates made submissions. And in his report, there are findings of the ways in which anti-Black racism was playing out. Also, the CERD committee itself, so the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination in 2007 and 2012, made very important findings as it relates to anti-Black racism in criminal justice systems and in education, employment, housing and healthcare and other spaces for Black folks. In 2017, again, the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent made similar findings. And so you see through this progression of engagement within the international system that there was more recognition of anti-Black racism within Canada. And while I would love to talk about a number of the different outcomes of that, concretely, because folks will say, okay, you had this recognition at the international level, what did this turn into? One of the strongest, I think, manifestations of late is Canada committed to undertaking a Black Canadian justice strategy. So we know that the justice system has produced tremendously racist outcomes for Black communities, but there hasn't been a systems-wide approach to addressing it. So there may be tweaks here, some changes here and there, but after the recognition came through the international forum for the need for, in the international space, was called an African Canadian justice strategy, Canada eventually now and openly acknowledges that it was actually the recognitions from international spaces that supported the community push for Canada Black Justice Strategy, which is forthcoming. So I'll leave it there.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. That's fantastic, Anthony. And thank you so much for just making the connection between the advocacy in those spaces and how that really supports community advocacy at home, and how it can lead to positive outcomes. One example I can mention from the Right to Housing space, for instance, is that advocacy at the Universal Periodic Review. In that process, over the years, I believe, did support the Right to Housing advocacy at home, which eventually led to the passing of the National Housing Strategy Act, which officially recognized the right to housing as a fundamental human right. So definitely opportunities in this work. So maybe we can go to Angela and Samia. Shalini really pointed out, and she's right, that this process seems very daunting for folks, for civil society organizations. So maybe you can tell us a bit about best practices in terms of engaging in this work, and perhaps any challenges that you've faced yourselves. And maybe we can start with Angela.
Hi. Yeah. So I just want to acknowledge first that I am joining you all from the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. And I feel very grateful that I'm able to join today. And so, yeah, I would love to talk about some of the best practices that I think would be helpful for people who want to engage with this work, but may have some limited resources or think that it might be a bit too challenging. So I was very fortunate to have been a staff lawyer early on in my career at the Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic. And so like Anthony, I was very lucky to kind of come into this organization under this tradition, under the guidance of Justice Avy Go, who was the executive director at the time, and really engage with these UN mechanisms. And at the time, I was a relatively young lawyer, but I got that education from the folks at COP, at Color of Poverty, and at the clinic and other clinics that we collaborated with. And one thing that I will say is collaboration is so key for civil society organizations that want to do this work and they have limited resources. So I'm just going to provide an example. When I was a staff lawyer there, I was tasked with drafting our shadow report essentially for the third UPR of
Angela,
Canada.
sorry, I just got a message to ask you if you could slow down.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Of course, yeah. I think
No
I'm
worries.
thinking about the 2-minute time limit, so I will slow down. So as I was saying, so I helped draft the shadow report for the third UPR of Canada, but it was really a joint effort between several organizations, including Color of Poverty, Council of Agencies Serving South Asians, OCASI, and SALCO. And we highlighted a number of issues in our shadow report, right, including immigration detention, racial discrimination, child welfare, et cetera, right? And even though our clinic took the lead on drafting the report, once the draft was done, we circulated it to what I will say were the key people of the working group, right, of like someone from each of the different organizations to review and provide feedback. And once we got that and we provided and got the feedback in, like, and incorporated those in, the final report was submitted by each of the organizations that had equal SOC status at the UN. So we submitted it, SALCO submitted it. And what this did was it actually increased our chances of being selected to present at a pre-session at the UN. So as part of the UPR is that if they think that your submission is something that they want you to be able to present on at a pre-session of the UPR, they will invite you to go to Geneva and do that. So our partner, SALCO, got selected, which was amazing. So then they took the lead on really creating that pre-session presentation. So this presentation is like a 6 to 7 minute presentation that you do before the UPR starts. So it allows like a representative from the different permanent missions that will be like working on that UPR to come and just learn about like what's going on. And so that's one component of it, right? So Shalini went and presented, but I also joined Shalini and we took it as an opportunity too to meet with a representative from the different permanent missions to really like advocate for the issues that we wanted to be raised to Canada in the actual UPR. And so our organization then devised a strategy like how do we do this effectively, because it's not possible for us to meet with every single permanent mission while we're there for like 3 days, right? So we really targeted in on countries that we knew already share some of the concerns that we were raising and were more likely to raise that. And so that's what Shalini and I did. Like we met, we had a list. We targeted the ones that we wanted to meet with. And, in terms of success or an outcome of it, some of what we raised with those representatives of those permanent missions were actually raised to Canada and made it into the final report. So that was quite gratifying to see that, from the first draft of some of those issues, it like ended up in the final report of the working group on the UPR. So I will say like collaboration is so key. Find other civil society actors or organizations that are advancing the same issues that you are. And one of the challenges may be that, you know, you have a lot of limited resources amongst the different organizations. However, I think that that challenge can be overcome by just establishing like a working group, right? So that if there's consistent communication and understanding of what the workflow is going to be like, because there are going to be timelines that you'll need to meet, then you're able to work as a group to kind of divvy up that work, right? Like one group might take the lead in the beginning to draft, the other group might take the lead on the presentation, etc. Right? So I think that that's where I'll end now, and then I'll pass it off to Samia.
That's super helpful. Thank you, Angela. Oh, Samia, please go ahead.
Great, thank you. So maybe I'll because Angela talked about some of the best practices. I'll talk about some of the challenges. I've been involved through the Color of Poverty, Color of Change in the process for a few years, but I think really actively involved last year through the Universal Periodic Review, and I think just generally my experience has been it's a slow process, and I think it can become disheartening at times while trying to get involved. We had a lot of, like Seema mentioned, a lot of meetings with the representatives from other countries in order to try to get some international pressure on Canada for some of the things that we were pushing for. Again, that was a bit of a challenge too, in trying to kind of get attention, right? So as just a civil society organization, sometimes that can be a challenge. But I think generally these days, I'm feeling the challenge is just starting to comprehend the structure of the UN system and how that is formed, and whether or not member states have equal power at the UN. So I'm beginning to question that, and that has become a challenge in me being involved in a lot of the advocacy. And that this may be a controversial position, but I just think the structure of the UN as it stands is a very colonial structure, and there is a higher platform and voice given to certain, white settlers, colonial societies, and other countries may not have the same power, right? Or there's instances where the entire, almost the entire world stands on a certain side of humanity, and then there's a powerful, handful of actors that stand on the other side, and those voices are carried over. So it's just been a challenge, just trying to continue to engage and just trying to continue to understand the importance of engagement, right? So this is something that we're dealing with internally. I know we're here to encourage folks here to get involved, but I want to be truthful and honest about that kind of struggle of being engaged, and then also kind of trying to figure out whether or not it's worth it, right? So I think it's still important for us not just to engage in all of these processes, but also to kind of be critical about the way that these structures work, and then trying to see how we can, as civil society organizations, perhaps advocate for change, right? So that member states do have equal voice and equal power, right? Especially states that have citizens that have been historically marginalized and victimized, right? So I would say, in addition to all of this process that's highlighted in the toolkit, I would encourage people to be critical and question some of some of the work that happens and who has power, who doesn't have power. Just today, I watched a video of a presentation. I can't remember which committee it was in, but a person said something that I found really profound. And she said, human rights has a skin color. And so it's, again, this kind of critical thinking is not meant to dishearten people, but it's meant to actually work together, collaborate. As Angela mentioned, it's always more effective to work in collaboration with other racial justice, social justice, human rights organizations to bring change.
Seema, if I may, Samia, I'm so glad that you raised that. And for me, I had the opposite reaction, because that's why I think the committee structure is so important, and why shadow reports with key recommendations from civil society organizations is so important, because it allows those countries from the the political global south to then beat up on those colonial spaces, right? I remember when we were in Geneva and the Canadian delegation started their presentation by saying the RCMP is not racist. Well, the whole room burst out in laughter, including all of the members, especially those from Africa and the Caribbean who have huge African diasporas here in Canada, where the messages are getting back home. For 5 minutes, the room just erupted in laughter that the Canadian delegation, with very serious faces, would start that. So yes, in the larger scheme of things, we're really clear about who, just the Security Council. It tells the story, right? In terms of who has veto and who doesn't. But I do think as civil society organization, we should use those opportunities to really arm, sorry for the military term, but to really arm those countries that sit on those committees to hold countries like Canada accountable with enough ammunition, so then they come back with a report that's hard-hitting, and that we encourage them to ensure accountability, that Canada is responding to what it is that they've put forward in terms of recommendations.
May I pick up on this here
Yes,
as
of
well?
course. Yeah. Yeah.
So I happen to be teaching a course right now that just finished today called The Right to Black Life under international human rights law. And so with law students, and law students are really skeptical about these international systems. And so, and I think healthily and rightly so, because of you see what's happening right now in the question of how Palestine and so many other freedom struggles are being mishandled or handled in that space. But why I'm sharing that is that when speaking specifically around people of African descent and just understanding the push and pull of the pitfalls of promise of these systems, there's some really great writing that I think folks can check out. If you don't catch the names, please send me a note after. But Tendaye Achume and Gay McDougall have written excellent reflections on it. Also, Professor Adele Blackett has recently published a piece in Just, well, it's a couple of years old now, but relevant to the challenges and pitfalls. But this is top of mind because I just finished teaching this article. Gay McDougall, who's a sitting member of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and has been in that space for years, partnered with Achume, Tendaye Achume, who is the most recent outgoing Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, to produce a reflection on how the UN system has responded to the Black Lives Matter movement. And ultimately, the words stand out to me again because they're fresh, but they hold, despite their different years of experience, and Gay McDougall for decades, says that we don't hold it's an untenable luxury to imagine that we can cede the space with global influence of power. So the struggle is happening there, and states are using that space to wield certain kinds of power that has very domestic implications. And so they say, we're not pessimistic, we're not optimistic, but just the real is, this is where the struggle is happening, and our people need to be involved and not cede it to the colonial masters. Civil society needs to agitate and enter that space and be seen, be heard, and organize for change. I'll just add that Canada has announced its desire for a seat on the Human Rights Council. We have a very unique opportunity to leverage Tendaye Achume and Gay McDougall are the names. I'm responding to a note, but somebody can send me a note after if you want clarity. But Canada has to maintain a certain level of credibility on the international stage in front of other states. So right now, in the next year and a half, we have a very special window of opportunity to access these spaces, find ways to deepen our understanding so that other states know what Canada's record are, and Canada will be more likely. I don't think manna is going to fall from the sky, everything's going to change and it's going to be remarkable, but I think they're going to be forced to listen in a way that they usually are not. There's still some change that does happen, but again, I think we're in a very sweet spot that we should take advantage of. So using our domestic issues, amplifying them so the international system knows, and then because Canada needs to maintain credibility in that forum, they'll have to figure out what their response is going to be, lest they lose the opportunity to be on the Human Rights Council. So I want to talk for that.
Thank you so much for that, Anthony. And everyone, really, I truly agree with your nuanced points. And Samia, I struggle with that personally as well. So it is such an important, it's so important to remind ourselves to question the systems, but also remember the value of civil society and why we need to insert ourselves there to advocate for change, even in the processes in these spaces. Thank you all very much. I think yes, Shalini, you've unmuted yourself. I think we're a bit over time, so I might turn it back over to
I
you.
don't even want to end. I just want to hear you all, but actually I really want to hear who's coming up next as well. Thank you, Seema, for putting together and moderating an incredible panel. Thank you to all of you for your honesty, your optimism, your challenges. I agree with Anthony that we have a particular moment in the next year and a half in terms of maybe holding it down and holding Canada's feet to the fire a little bit. And a special thank you to Angela for not mentioning to everyone the copious amounts of Swiss chocolate I ate when we were together in Geneva, which I begged her to keep out of her presentation. And now I'm just revealing to everybody. And so thank you to this panel. And coming up now, to be honest, I've had an opportunity to meet, and John probably doesn't remember this, but I have had an opportunity through Color of Poverty to hear John and to meet John Powell. And the last time I think was about 5 years ago. And in thinking about setting up this day, and actually when I'm feeling challenged and when I'm feeling down, I think about some of the things that he said in the time that we met, and the absolute inspiration that it brought to me. And I'm really hoping that you will feel that energy as well from John. I'm going to just share my screen and invite John to be spotlighted if we can do that.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, John. And so I'm not going to read through this entire bio. And John, I just wanted to let you know that I'll be shifting the slides for you, so you can let me know at any point when you want me to go to the next slide. But John is the director of the Other and Belonging Institute and a professor of law, African American and ethnic studies at the University of California. And I'll leave this slide up for a second. And just to reiterate that for me, actually, the words that John delivered and when I had a chance to see him speak have stuck with me since that time for the past 5 years, and have given me a sense of calmness and purpose and optimism about the work that we do, which is sometimes challenging. And so, John, with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to you to provide us with some closing remarks and our end of the day keynote. And thank you so much for being here with us today.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. I wish I was there with you in person. And I do remember a meeting, and one of the reasons I keep coming back is because of the work you're doing. I know it's challenging. So I have some slides, and I will run through them and also make them available. So for those of you who want to spend some time with them, I should also mention, hopefully some of you can come to our conference. I think it's April 23rd. You can check on our website for the exact date, but it'll be here in the Bay Area. And again, it would be great to have you there. So if we can have the next slide. So we're the Othering and Belonging Institute, and what you're dealing with Canada and the United States and the world is really the problem of othering. And while othering can take on a particular form, it's a generalized process. Next slide. We have the next slide. So this is a global problem. The problem of, if we can go back just one more, sorry about that. Go back one. Okay, so the question is, okay, having a little trouble here. I wanted the previous one with all the arrows. If we could go there. Okay, that's it. All right, so stay here just 1 second. So othering is a strange word, I know. So you've heard of racism, you've heard of homophobia, you've heard of um, xenophobia, you've heard of the degradation to indigenous people. But some of you may or may not have heard of othering. So how does othering fit into this? First of all those things are expressions of othering, and I'll say more about that in a minute. But the problem with othering is not unique to Canada, the United States, Europe. It's actually a global problem. And that's why I say it's the problem of the 21st century, that virtually every society has some group that they other. And that experience is expanding, is accelerating. We're seeing the rise of fascism, the rise of authoritarianism, the rise of ethnic nationalism, literally throughout the world. There's no part of the world that has not been touched, and it continues to grow. One question is why? What's going on now? When a few years ago, we thought we were on at least a projector to deal with some of these issues in a much more constructive way. And one of the ways to think about what produces this is change itself. Change produces anxiety, not just in humans, but also in mammals. When change is happening really fast, we can't process it. It creates anxiety. It creates stress in our nervous system. How we organize this stress, how we think about this stress, depends on the stories and leadership they were exposed to. So there are many different ways of thinking about the stress. The two major ways is one, that there's something going on, and usually someone that's a threat, that they're trying to take away your language, take away your culture, take away your job, take. There's some way a threat to who you are, to your well-being. That's called the breaking language. And in politics throughout the world, again, breaking language is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And so the breaking language doesn't just name the other, it says the other is a threat. And we have to do something to contain the other. And sometimes it's build walls, sometimes it's deport them, sometimes it's kill them. That's breaking language. And so remember that breaking, basically tearing apart our human connection. The other major way of dealing with this anxiety is called bridging. And bridging is just the opposite. Bridging is connecting our interconnectedness, connecting our shared humanity, connecting that we have a shared future. So those are the two main ways to deal with it. Another one is bonding, which I won't deal with because of time. But how we arrive at these is largely through stories. So there's stories to talk about the scary, evil other that's coming after us, or the stories basically saying we can build a larger we. And Canada has had a really complex history of both, of being more welcoming, certainly than the United States, at the same time dealing with xenophobia and othering at the same time. And so which of these will dominate depends largely on the stories we tell, on the leaders, on the culture that we consume. And so I want to really promote that you deeply engage in bridging stories. Next slide. So as I already talked about, there's no particular way of othering. We could do it by race, by gender. These are social phenomena. They're not natural. So you may think we naturally gravitate to our own. That's actually a myth. There's no natural own. What becomes natural is a matter of sociological agreement. And so, I mean, I just came back from Belfast, right? So in the United States, people might think of, well, Christians are naturally drawn to each other. Well, in Belfast, they had a 30-year war between Catholics and Protestants. Those of you who know Islam know that there's sometimes fights between two different sects of Islam. Even in our communities, even in our workplace, we'll see fights between people who look like they should be on the same side. And so there's no natural category, if you will, and there's no natural othering. And so we can take anything and turn it into a problem. We can also take anything and turn it into a bridge. So these are social constructions but they're still real facts. The next slide. While we're waiting for the next slide, you'll notice intuitive much at the color of poverty, which I think is quite important. So when we think about othering, we have to remember, back to the next slide, the previous slide, that the opposite of othering is not saming. We don't try to make everyone the same. One liberal response to changing diversity, changing expressions is to say we're all exactly the same. Well, that's a nice sounding sentiment is simply not true. And again, when you think of Canada's rich history of being a multiracial, multi-language, multicultural society, you've embraced that in a way that we have not in the United States. The United States is still fighting over, are we all the same or are we all different? So the problem of othering is not fixed by saming, but by belonging. Next slide. This slide is actually just looking at an arc of history. And you see this arrow. If you go back not long ago, 250 years ago, and certainly before, for thousands of years, the world was organized in explicit extreme hierarchy. There were a few people who were the noble, the kings, the queens, the czars, and the rest of the world was essentially the serfs, the slaves, and who were treated with extreme indignity. And again, this was a global phenomenon that existed for about 12,000 years. It rose with the rise of agriculture and what's called civilization, modern history, which is about 12,000 years old. And one of the first expressions to challenge this at the nation state level happened about 250 years ago. And there were two countries in particular that embraced the notion of equality and dignity and challenged this notion that some people were inherently better than others. And one of those countries was the United States, who was influenced greatly by the other country, which was France. So both the United States and France built into their founding documents the importance of recognizing that people are of equal value. That in a sense became even more codified, if you will, in 1948 with the UN Declaration of Human Rights, basically saying all people have basic human rights. We know that's not a reality, but even as an aspiration, that's such a radical concept and a relatively new concept. And so we've moved again to look at dignity. How do we actually treat everyone with dignity? And if we had more time, I could talk to you about why there's a pushback against equality or against equity. Equity recognizes that equality has to look at context. And so it's not treating everyone the same, it's treating everyone with equal dignity and different. That's equity. And we think that this long arc is moving and continues to move, not just toward equity, not just toward equality, but belonging. And so that this really, all over the world, but there'll be a pushback. There'll be those who will have strong objections to the notion that everyone's of equal value, or as we say, everyone belongs. So we believe we have a moonshot, which we said belonging without othering, that everyone, every race, every religion, the way people make love, who they love, everyone belongs. Next slide. So what do you get from belonging that you don't get from inclusion? Well, a couple of things. Belonging is like inclusion. You could think of belonging as inclusion 2.0. But belonging recognizes, among other things, co-creation. And what do we mean by co-creation? Well, when we think about inclusion, we think about inviting people into an existing structure and norm, where the people being invited in are coming in as guests. It's better than being excluded, but it's not being You know, you sort of, sometimes it's like leave some aspect of yourself at the door. We don't want to deal with the fact that maybe you're gay, or maybe the fact that you're Black, which was the case with James Baldwin. And so inclusion is being invited in on someone else's terms. Belonging is when you are co-creating the thing you're joining. So you're not just becoming part of Canada or Ottawa or the United States or your community or your school or your workplace. You're coming and you're participating. You don't get to design it just like you want it. You have to co-create it. You say we all have a voice, an equal voice in terms of creating this new world that we're birthing. Next slide.
Sorry, John, this is audio technical support. There have been a few times where your audio have been disconnecting. If it's okay for me to ask you to maybe turn off your camera, this usually helps with the audio to be more correct.
Okay,
So
let me turn off my camera.
Please, if that's okay.
Sure.
This might help with the audio to work more properly.
Okay, I'll do that.
Thank you, John.
Okay, so what you should be seeing now, I'm turning off my camera, so hopefully my camera's off. So you see some circles. And if you can't hear me or if there's a problem, please let me know. The circle, the first one is exclusion. You think of the structure as being the white circles, and the colors dots are excluded from the white circles. That happens sometimes with segregation, with immigration, with the way we treat indigenous populations. And then we say, let's move to inclusion. Again, you're included in the circle. The structure of the circle, the norms of the circle, the rules of the circle are already set, and you're asked to join, and you have to make all the accommodations to the existing norms. The final one on the right is the belonging. And belonging is no longer a circle. When all the different groups and people come in with their customs, norms, religions, practices, something new evolves. And that new thing is co-created by people coming together. Next slide. Where we are right now, we don't have containers that can hold the growing diversity that's happening throughout the world. And so what's happening is that older societies, or societies that are sort of trying to hold on to something that they can't hold on to, at the same time that more and more people are coming in. And so we have what's called cracks in our container. And we may say, what's a container? Believing in our institutions, our political or democracy, our structures, the things that we take for granted. Those things we no longer believe in, and we don't trust them anymore. Our doctors, our scientists, everything is being called into question. When that happens, it creates a sense of being othered by everyone. Everyone feels like out of sorts. Going back to that early slide of the anxiety of change, everyone's feeling anxious. And every election is an exaggerated expression of that anxiety. Everyone feels like in the world that's evolving, they may not belong. What's going to happen to my group if this person wins the election? And so this problem is not a problem just in terms of what's called marginalized people. The problem of being othered and feeling like we don't belong is a global problem. Next slide. Again, we're also seeing a backlash against equity. And part of it is that the way that we think about equity largely in terms of competition between groups. And I think that's an unhealthy frame. Again, the stories we tell matter, the words we use matter. And so we've said, we're not trying to get whatever the dominant group has. What we're trying to get is something that's independent of the dominant group. We're trying to get a healthy society where everyone thrives. And when we look carefully, we know that even the group that's called the dominant group oftentimes is not thriving. And so we state what the universals are. We state really what everybody should have. And then we say, in order to get there, you need targeted strategies because we're situated differently. So it doesn't mean collapsing everybody, the universality. It's not collapsing everybody into being the same. It's saying We all want certain things, deserve certain things, just because we're human, just because we're here as being part of humanity and part of the earth. We want dignity, we want respect, but the way we get it will vary because we're situated differently. So that's targeted universalism. Again, sometimes I refer to it as equity 2.0. Next slide. And targeted universalism doesn't put people in competition with each other. It doesn't say you have to give up what you get in order for me to get what I need. It's basically saying everybody deserves certain things. We have to articulate what those things are, and how we do that is through co-creation. So we talked a little bit about bridging and breaking, and I'll come back to that now with a few more points. The next slide. I should mention, I just turned in a book manuscript on the power of bridging, so it'll be out later this year. Again, breaking is based on fear of the other, fear of isolation, fear that I won't belong because of that group. And so when breaking has happened, it's not a rational process necessarily. There's something else going on. We're being motivated and activated by fear. Next slide. Bridging is just the opposite. Bridging is, in a sense, motivated by possibility, motivated by hope, motivated by curiosity. So yes, we're changing, but instead of turning on each other, we turn toward each other. We're doing this together. Canada is becoming a different country. The United States is becoming a different country, but a country, hopefully, where everyone belongs. It may surprise some of you to know that Canada has designated itself as a belonging country. So you are actually ahead of us in the United States in terms of recognizing the importance of belonging. And your General Secretary has written a book on belonging, so I would highly recommend that to you. Next slide. So there can be bridging stories and there can be breaking stories. Next slide. So in bridging stories, in breaking stories, there can be what we call hard breaks, and there can also be soft breaks. Hard breaks might be where you literally kill someone, where you say this person's not human. A soft break may be where you say someone still belongs to the country or to the family, but they're not allowed to speak, or they're less than, but you don't totally dehumanize them. And in our work, I sort of look at the different ways in which we can break. Another soft break might be someone who has Alzheimer. We think of this person as somehow diminished. And it doesn't mean that they have full cognition, but do they have full dignity? We might pity them as opposed to hate them. Next slide. When we bridge, we're constructing a new we. And the bridge doesn't mean to actually agree on everything. So when you see someone's humanity, it doesn't mean you're going to go buy them coffee. It doesn't mean you agree on their politics. What it does mean is that you're willing to acknowledge their humanity, you're curious about them, and you're willing to listen. That's it. But that may seem like a little thing, but when we listen deeply, it's extremely powerful. Next slide. And they're long bridges and they're short bridges. So a short bridge would be where you and someone else, you actually agree on what those universals should be. You agree on what kind of society you want. So maybe they're even the same family, the same church, the same synagogue, the same mosque, but you might disagree on tactics. That's a shorter bridge. A long bridge would be where you maybe don't agree on those long-term outcomes. You don't agree politically. And so you can't start with that agreement. You have to build that. That's called a long bridge. And I often remind people that my friend Bell Hooks, who passed away recently, said, bridges are made to walk on. And by that, she means if you engage in bridging, both the other group and your own group may cast dispersions at you. They may not celebrate what you're doing because you're reaching out to a group that's been designated as the other. Next slide. Again, bridging requires listening. And we talk about co-creating not just among humans, but co-creating with the earth, co-creating with the rest of life. And one of the ways we co-create, one of the ways we belong is through bridging. And so that suggests that we listen to each other. We listen to people who don't always agree with us. We listen to the earth. Next slide. And we tell stories. We live in stories. So there's a lot of literature on this. People believe a lot of things about human beings. There's some belief that we are hardwired to other. We're hardwired to fight each other. There's a lot to suggest that's actually not true. And one of the things that we have as Homo sapiens, which not all the humans had, was the ability to tell stories. And our stories are about meaning and symbols. And the meaning and symbols are not given. So when something happens, it's not just that something has happened. What does it mean? What are the stories we're going to tell about it? They matter a lot. We live in stories. And so we can tell bridging stories or we can tell breaking stories. We have some agency in terms of the stories we tell and the stories we consume. And it matters which stories we tell and which stories we consume. So I'm encouraging you to sort of seriously think about bridging stories, belonging stories. Next slide. And when you think about stories, here's a little schematic as the way to think about stories. Who's in the story? Who's left out? Who is the protagonist? Who's the villain? Who's telling the story? Who is the audience? Just ask those questions. So if a story is where one group is left out and they're the villain, without even knowing anything else, you already have a problem. And so one of the big questions is, who is the audience? If you're in an environment where you're dealing with a lot of anxiety, as we talked about at the beginning of this talk, a lot of change, who is the audience? The next slide. And the audience is the lizard. And some of you may recognize this, some of you may not, that when we are in a state of heightened fear, the part of the brain that's most activated is called the amygdala. That's the part of the brain we share with the lizard. That part of the brain is not rational. That part of the brain serves a purpose, fight or flight, but it's not looking at footnotes, it's not reading reports. It doesn't always even care about the truth, but it cares about being seen. It cares about being observed. You know, when you watch people when they're arguing, sometimes they're yelling at each other, and you might say, "You're standing right next to each other. Why are you yelling?" In a sense, they're saying, "They don't really hear me." So we have to tell stories to the lizard. The lizard in a heightened state of anxiety, the audience is the lizard. We all bring our lizards to meetings, and then we just scream at each other, and we don't recognize each other. Next slide. I think we have a few minutes for questions. Hopefully I didn't go over too long, but I know we started a little late, so thank you.
Thank you so much. We absolutely do have a few minutes for questions. Does anyone have a comment or a question? Oh, perfect. I see that. Amin, go ahead. Amin.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, John, thank you so much for your continued leadership in this space, but also helping us to think a little bit differently. When we start looking at overlaying some traditional value systems like Afrocentric value systems or indigenous or other value systems of traditional communities, especially of the global South, in what ways can some of these things around belonging, bridging, and thinking differently about equity and inclusion might differ?
Yeah, so a couple of things. Again, this is a global phenomenon. So a lot of times we think about, frankly, we think about in terms of colonialism, we think about Europeans, we think about stuff that's happening in the global north, and it is, but it's happening all over the world. So I spent some time in South Africa, for example, or in Kenya, Tanzania, othering, different scale, but even around immigration, othering is happening there as well. And the thing that's interesting, it takes on a different form, because in the United States or in Europe, immigration issues oftentimes take on racialized issues. Whereas in South Africa or Kenya, race is not the issue. Or if we go to India, which I've lived in for a couple of years, again, the way their hardcore othering happens there is not so much about race, but around caste, around religion, and around colorism. So part of it is it allows us to see how these phenomena play out in different parts of the world. And of course, colonialism by its very nature is a structured kind of othering. It's just saying that some people don't matter, or if they matter, is their labor that we want to abstract, their bodies we want to extract, their land we want to extract, but not their personhood, not their soul, not their spirit. We don't recognize that. And so as we sort of struggle with these things, we need to be clear. We're not just trying to, as I say, flip the switch where one group was on top and now they're going to be on the bottom. We're actually trying to say, how do we create a world where everyone belongs and no one is other? And that's a problem not just in the United States or Russia or China. It's a global problem.
I see some comments in the chat. Does anybody else have a question for John? John, oh, go ahead, Seema, please.
Yeah, I was kind of curious if you could give us, and I know you have to a certain degree, like a concrete example of this being used successfully.
Sure. So the application is quite profound once you start looking for it. So you can think about in the US context, when they would try to have schools, there was a black school and a white school, that could be any kind of school. The black kids would come to oftentimes be bused to the white school, and then the black kids would have to adapt to all the practices of the white school. And if you do this right through targeting versus belonging, it's not a black school or white school. It was a white school, but when you bring these groups together, it's not one group school versus the other group, it's their school. And there have been places, and not a lot of schools, literally thousands of them now, that actually, when they approach it like, how do we make this ours? Not yours, not mine, but ours. What does that mean in terms of the curriculum? What does it mean in terms of student assignment? What does it mean in terms of teachers? What does it mean in terms of which sports we play? Another concrete example is in the United States, when women came into the workforce in large numbers in the 70s and 80s, they would often have those physical places would often have pornographic pictures of women on the wall. Not an exaggeration. Again, the women would say, oh, can we have those taken down? And the men's first response was, well, that's just the way things are here. We've always had pictures on the wall. Maybe we can make space and you can put your pictures up too. We sort of missed the point. And out of that came the idea of the hostile work environment. And so you can't have pornographic pictures in a public workspace anymore. But it's, again, an idea of, do the women adjust to the norms and conditions that are set by the previous groups, the men, or do they create something new? Think about a building, right? I mean, I say, if you design a building or about disability, right? Do you co-create it so the building actually functions for everyone, or you design it with one group being invisible, and then when the group show up, it's like, oh, we forgot to put on a ramp. We'll put it on. Usually then it's tacky, it doesn't work well. So there's just thousands of examples. Anytime we think about structures, and if certain groups are left out, one of the things I talk about is there's the explicit other, and then there's the implicit other. The explicit other, we know who that group is. And we think about them a lot. maybe negatively, but we think about them. Then there's the implicit others. They're invisible. They just don't show up in our mind. And so when we do things, we don't design for them. We don't listen to them. We don't include them. And when we do include them, we include them on our terms. I'll give you one last example. I fly way too much. You go on an airplane. Think about the luggage racks on an airplane. Where are they? They're overhead. Well, there's a certain part of the population that's shorter than the other part of the population. Of course, I'm referring to women. As a group, women are shorter than men. As a group, women have less upper body strength than men. And as a group, women carry more luggage than men. So the design of that structure is putting a disadvantage on women. So what women do, and they don't even talk about it much, right? What women do, they check their luggage. But that means you have to be at the airport an extra 45 minutes early, and you leave 45 minutes late, sometimes without your luggage. That's not belonging. Women did not get to co-create those airplanes. Those airplanes were designed, I was eventually, mainly by men or men approximate people. So that's an example. And again, once we start looking at structures, it's everywhere. Because we design systems, and the system carries certain norms and values, but they're not designed to belong, to create belonging.
Thank you, John. I just want to check in with you because we do have questions in the Q&A, one question in the Q&A, one in the chat, and one hand raised here. Whether, are you able to stay with us for a little bit longer?
I'm running a little late, but why don't we do this? Why don't all three questions, you read or share all three questions, and then I'll try to answer what I can.
Okay, let me try to do that.
Okay.
So the first question is, could you please talk a bit about how we can build bridges with people who have extremist views that remove people's dignity and hold power? Example, right-wing politicians who effectively change policies and laws that have an immediate impact on those who are othered. The second question in the chat is, could you speak to the first order of othering on these lands, waters, and territories in Americas, and how we might better move forward together in the Indigenous settler relationship? And the third question is a hand raised, and I'm going to pronounce this person's name and likely do it incorrectly, but I'll just call on Agdas Mi or Ami.
Yeah, that's my last name. My name is Mernouche.
Okay, Mernouche, go ahead.
Yes, thanks, John. I've been following your writings for many years. I'm benefiting from that, and today is another one of those occasions. So my question, I don't see much in your writings that referring to this, or I haven't found it. You may have a lot of it. It's, in workplaces and in society as a whole, we come across for the system, the master wanting to keep the existing norm. They use racialized people, as was talked earlier. Racialized people can be part of the solution or can be part of the problem. So they use racialized people as gatekeepers to keep the previous norms, and while just co-opting different vocabulary to say they are anti-racist or anti-oppressive. So in those cases, how do you build bridges when you have racialized people who are gatekeepers?
Right. So great questions, and I probably won't answer any of them adequately, but let me try to at least touch on all three of them. The last question, actually, I talk about this explicitly in my new book called The Power of Bridging, and I talk about we're complicated. And I in the United States context, Clarence Thomas is a great example of a person who is African American presenting, but not African American in terms of his sensibilities or in terms of his empathy. He has a lot of his writing shows, and from my reading, almost antipathy toward Black people, even though he's Black himself. And he's therefore, and I think that's one of the reasons that he was promoted to the highest court in the United States. So let me just say, the long bridges and short bridges. in some ways, don't start with the most difficult. Bridging, like anything else, is like a muscle. You get better at it as you do it. And then you also have to take care of yourself. If someone's pointing a gun at you, you may not be able to bridge with that person. Maybe you should run. It's a realistic thing, but it's actually being done now by all the major organizing networks in the United States. And in fact, they're not only engaged in bridging, they're engaging with, we're working on a project with them about long bridging, which is basically how do you listen to or talk to that person that's, promoting hostile, even violent things towards your group. So again, it's complicated because the leaders and the group people and the rank and file people are not the same. Many times the leaders actually benefit financially in terms of power by creating a society where we're all breaking, creating a fractured society, creating polarization. They actually benefit from that. Most people, including most people who work on the other side, don't benefit. So I would say white supremacy doesn't benefit, in real terms, most white people. And so what we found is that when you really listen to people, something quite magical happens. It's actually 100 times more influential to deeply listen to people than it is to argue and try to persuade them. This is a practice, though. So I'm again suggesting that you start off with something that's not too difficult. Don't start off running a marathon. Just walk around the block for the first, and eventually you'll get better at it. Now, I know, again, these were inadequate answers. And again, we haven't even spent much time talking about how do you change structures. But I'll end just by saying this. I oftentimes share that when I talk about this, I have a good friend who's a pastor, and he would sometimes say, "So John, are you saying I have to bridge with the devil?" And my response to him, as Pastor McBride, I say, don't start there. Don't start with the devil. But also be careful who you call the devil. But start with something that's very doable. Start with something that's closer to you. And as you get better at it, one day you will be able to sit down with people who would have otherwise been called the devil, and things will happen. It won't solve all problems at all times, but it's I think, a very important tool for not only what ails us today, but for the world we want to live in. So with that, I need to stop because I'm running late to another meeting.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you for giving us your extra time and for centering us again in that idea of bridging and belonging, and leaving us today at the end of the day with a sense of optimism. I really, really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you. Let me just add one more comment. You use the word optimist because I have literally hanging up in my bedroom a placard that says, I'm not an optimist or a pessimist. I'm a possibilist. And possibility, I think things are possible. We don't know how they're going to turn out, but our engagement matters. And so that's what I want to leave you with, is that we collectively have agency. And so we need to actually use that agency to try to call and participate in the world that we want to see.
Thank you, John. You're probably not seeing the chat, but it's blowing up with thank yous.
Thank all of you.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, and so thank you all for joining us. And to end today, we wanted actually to call on one of our original Color of Poverty founders, and probably even before founding it, the thoughts of it were in this person's mind, and to have a reflection to close the day out. So I'm going to turn it over to Debbie Douglas.
Thank you. Thank you, Shalini. Thank you all. What a wonderful, I can listen to John go on forever. I love how John ended that. He's not an optimist and he's not a pessimist. He's a possibilist. I'm going to become a possibilist and become pragmatic in what we work on. I'm not going to take up much of your time. It's been a long, heavy day. I am feeling full. I am sure you are too. There's so much information, so much new knowledge, so much great discussion. Earlier this morning, someone asked, what are we going to do with all of this information? And that's what I hope we go away with a question. What are we going to, we have so much information, what are we going to do? And that we come to the conclusion that we need to band together to move forward a progressive agenda. I'm going to share some of the highlights that I heard and that stuck with me in no order at all. This is what came to me. Employment equity policy is human rights policy. Equity in the workplace is the cornerstone of building decent workplaces. We need to reinvigorate our movement for the adoption of an employment equity provincial legislation here in Ontario. There is a bit of pushback on that, which I loved, that says we have a federal employment equity policy. The review report talks about having the employment, the Federal Employment Act cover all jurisdictions. Is that a strategy we should be using instead of trying to reinvent the wheel here in Ontario and in other provinces across the country? Something for us to consider as we come back together to restart this movement for employment equity in every province and every territory. Part of this work involves another highlight for me. Part of this work involves identifying centers of influence and control and power. For example, how do we leverage the provincial anti-racism legislation that we have here in Ontario and the Anti-Racism Directorate? How do we leverage that work that we have done? Data. Data is critical. It's critical to this work, but we must learn about and begin to apply a data justice lens. In data collection, we should always lead with purpose, with transparency, and with the practice of having the community lead the work. Take seriously the adage, nothing about us without us. Intersectional organizing is our only path to success. That means that relationship building is critical to our success as a movement. And this is especially important with building relations with Indigenous communities. I think the limited participation of Indigenous peoples in our research report is instructive. Targeted universalism. I love to hear John talk about this. It does not pit people against each other, quite the opposite. Everyone wins. And the way forward is to ensure that this is true is through co-creation of solutions. And a reminder, not only with us as humans, but with the earth and all living things. Some words that I took away from John: diversity, responsibility, care, power, and agency. Words and concepts that should always inform our work. And bridges. Bridging can be difficult, but it can also be a place of power as groups come together to advance this work. And I really like this, and both Professor Blackett as well as Marie Clark Walker in our breakout group talked about this. And it's a take on the old saying, diversity is a fact and inclusion is a choice. I liked diversity is a choice. Diversity is a fact. Inclusion is a choice, and equity is the law. And Marie did a twist on it and said, diversity is a fact, equity is the law, and when you put them together, it results in inclusion. And another quote for the day, and I'm almost done. In this world where we are trying to bring down capitalism, we need to hold each other close with love. And finally, And this is a commentary on Dr. Martin Luther King's comment on the moral arc bending towards justice. And we saw John used it in one of his slides. It just so happens that this morning on Facebook, I saw a post from Fred Hahn, some of you may know from CUPE, Ontario. And the post actually was by someone named John Padlovitz. The quote was from, and he says, "Let's stop trusting." And this is our challenge moving forward from today's very rich conversation. So this is a challenge for us to take up as we move forward in our next steps and about employment and employment equity and how we create decent work and we address other issues. And the quote says, "Let's stop trusting that the arc of the moral universe will simply bend toward justice and decide collectively to be the arc benders." Let me say that again. Let's stop trusting that the arc of the moral universe will simply bend toward justice and decide to be arc benders. I leave you with that. Thank you for fabulous organizing. Thank you for reports that I look forward to reading. Shalini, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I'm not going to keep us any longer. I'm going to do something pragmatic and say when you exit, you're going to get our evaluation popping up. Please, it is tremendously helpful from us to hear from you on the things that were helpful, the things that we could have done better, the different ways in which we can think about next steps in terms of bringing us all back together in collaboration. And I'm certainly going away, and I hope all of you are today, inspired, feeling less angry, because I've been living in a very angry space for a while now, and really actually thinking about, how do I tell stories of belonging?
Yes.
How do I change my narrative around them, us, this, that, and think about different ways in which we can build bridges and advocate to get to where, we all hope we'll be. So thank you all for taking the time to join us and be with us today. And hopefully, and I'm certain that hopefully this is not going to be the last time that we all connect in very different ways. Thank you all.
Thank you, Shalini. Great hosting and holding space.